Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law and I thank you for listening. As well as our podcast, Arab Digest has a daily reader-supported newsletter providing unique insights into the Middle East and North Africa. Check out our website at arabdigest.org. Our newsletter features a top team of the very best analysts, commentators, and writers. And we're offering you a 2-month sampler of the newsletter for free. So why not make Arab Digest your go-to source for an objective, independent analysis of the Arab world? That's arabdigest.org. My guest today is Kristian Coates Ulrichsen, a Middle East Fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. Kristian is a regular contributor to the Arab Digest newsletter and podcasts and the author of several books on the Gulf states. His latest will be out shortly. Its title is Kingdom of Football, Saudi Arabia and the Remaking of World Soccer. I know it's going to make for a fascinating read, and I'm going to get Kristian back to talk about his new book very soon. But today, we are focusing on the Trump peace proposal for ending the Gaza war. Kristian, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
I'm looking at this 20-point Trump deal that's supposed to sort out the situation in Gaza, and it brought me back to the deal that Trump signed in 2020, actually in Doha with the Taliban, which I think was written on one piece of paper. It gave the Taliban virtually everything they wanted, and Trump got very little or nothing in return. This intervention appears to have more thought behind it. I'm just wondering if you can track back to when you first read it, what your first thoughts were. Because for me, I read it and I thought, there's some really interesting aspects to this proposal.
Yes, I think it's certainly much more detailed than the proposal or the plan that was put to the Taliban in 2020. There's certainly a lot of thought that seems to have gone into the plan. Individuals like Tony Blair, for example, have been involved, and for all of his ills or misconduct in the past, Tony Blair has at least 20 years of history of working with a quartet and other Middle Eastern issues. The devil perhaps is in the detail. It's a 20-point plan. There are so many sequences that will have to be followed and steps that will need to be taken to ensure that a plan becomes reality. And I think that's where perhaps some of the weaknesses may lie. Trump is certainly engaged and on the plan for now. It may not be a coincidence that the Nobel Peace Prize will be announced in several days. So we're obviously talking on the anniversary of October the 7th. And I think certainly Trump has one eye on posterity, but for this plan to succeed, it will require long-term engagement. And I think what we've seen from Trump so far, both with Russia, Ukraine, when he came into office promising that conflict will be over within one day, we saw a flurry of initial meetings, one in Saudi Arabia, a couple of follow-up meetings, and then he sort of lost interest when it became clear that the problem was more intractable and more complicated than perhaps had been perceived. So while I think it's welcome that there's so much more detail in the plan, and I think it's certainly to be received at least as a basis for something to negotiate, I think it will require something we haven't seen from the Trump administration so far, which is sustained long-term engagement. And I think all the parties in Cairo meeting to discuss the plan will probably be doing so with one eye on potential reactions from the US. So the US does have leverage. Trump does have leverage over all the parties, but he needs to make sure that that leverage continues. It's not just a sort of 3 or 4 day long window, because if that is the case, then this plan probably won't go anywhere.
Yeah, do you think that he really has leaned on Netanyahu hard? Because as you say, this Nobel Peace Prize, which he clearly covets, and the decision coming up in just a few days, do you think he just thought, all right, I've got to put the pressure on Netanyahu now, and I'm going to do something that no other U.S. president has done?
Well, I think certainly Trump would welcome the idea that he can do something that nobody else could do, and that he alone could go further than Joe Biden, than Barack Obama, than George W. Bush. That is we saw that with Trump's hopes to secure a deal with Iran too. It would have been a better deal in his view than Obama got in 2015 with the JCPOA. I mean, Trump is very much thinking in terms of one-upmanship between him and previous US presidents. So, the idea that perhaps he and he alone could put significant pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to come to the table. And Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, has been in power for so many years that he has effectively sort of dealt with many previous US presidents who've tried to think they could do the same. If Trump thinks he can go further, then he would certainly try. And I think he probably saw a window of opportunity after the 9th of September attack on Qatar that really clearly angered Trump and the people around him, clearly harmed or had the potential to harm US interests in the Middle East and especially in the Gulf. So I think maybe Trump used that as a way to sort of leverage Netanyahu and to say, look, this needs to stop, and you need to at least go to the table, and we'll support you if you come to the table, but you have to come.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the Trump family has lots of interests, financial and otherwise, in not just Qatar, but indeed several of the other Gulf states. You mentioned this, Kristian, that about the vagueness, and that's been a criticism. For example, it doesn't address other Gaza militant groups like Islamic Jihad. You look at where the Palestinians are in this picture; they're at the bottom of the totem pole. What do you make of those criticisms?
Yes, I think one of the biggest criticisms is that this is basically a plan that has been developed in the White House and in the US effectively with some input maybe from Tony Blair. It isn't a plan that is based around Palestinians. The Palestinians are going to be on the receiving end of the plan. It will be dictated or imposed on them if they agree. And of course, Trump has also made it clear that if Hamas doesn't agree, then all hell will break loose. So this isn't a plan that is being developed with Palestinian input. And I think that will be a clear weakness going forward. I mean, I think we've seen in the past how we've had international administrations in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in East Timor in the 1990s and in the 2000s. But those were plans that had UN backing. They were supported and developed by the UN, by real international sort of cooperation. This one, and of course, had local input as well. This one doesn't seem to have that. So I think a lack of an international, or lack of a local mandate, and this sort of idea that it could be imposed from outside, I think could be problems. I mean, there's going to be an international stabilization force, a transitional authority, but if they don't really have, or and a financing mechanism, but if they don't really have a sort of a local input, I think that that could be problematic. And of course, if it's perceived to be a plan that basically is seen to favor Israeli rather than Palestinian interests, then of course that might be an issue too. And of course, as you said, the lack of inclusion of other Palestinian groups, perhaps in the talks, or at least in the negotiations, or at least in the meetings to decide whether to accept the plan, is also maybe a limiting factor as well.
And how do you think Hamas has played it so far? Because they've said we'll accept some of the plan, but we want to look at the whole
Well,
plan.
I think
And
yes. I
yeah,
mean, I think it's up. I mean, I don't think anybody really knows to the degree to which this is a plan that is open for negotiation, or if it's a take it or leave it plan. And I think maybe the sort of Hamas position is we can negotiate, but I think Trump's position perhaps has been that this is the plan. You have 3 or 4 days to accept it. Now, we have also reports that the Trump administration is putting pressure on its Arab partners, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, to themselves apply whatever leverage they can do on Hamas to accept it. Because I think certainly Trump seems to want this wrapped up within a few days. And perhaps again, thinking back to the Russia-Ukraine example, it seems to sort of want this sort of glory of being able to be the peacemaker, but finding that peace is much harder to actually achieve in practice.
yeah, it's almost like a child in a toy store. I want it and I want it now kind of feel to it. But
Yes.
here we've got this horrendously complex situation that's gone on for decades and decades and decades. It's a bit of madness, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, given Trump's transactional streak and given the fact that none of the parties at the negotiating table will want to be the one that gets blamed by Trump if the plan falls apart, and to be seen by Trump as perhaps denying him a Nobel Peace Prize. Nobody wants to be on the receiving end of that blame, least of all Netanyahu, of course. Now, that does give some degree of leverage to the US for now. I mean, some of the problems of past peace proposals has been that there's been an initial meeting. I mean, think back not just to Oslo, but then to Annapolis in 2007. Other meetings over the years. There's been an initial meeting, and then gradually that process has faltered. It's sort of run into the sands. It's slowed, lost momentum, and gradually fallen apart. So I think what we've seen from the past is sustained direct engagement from the very top is going to be necessary. But now we have that with Trump. But I think we've also seen with Trump that isn't necessarily going to last more than a week. There's a risk that we have another process like with Oslo, where you have an initial plan and then the parties blame each other for lack of implementation. And we just have another cycle of recrimination and sort of accusation and counter-accusation.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the Gulf author and analyst Kristian Coates Ulrichsen. Arab Digest has more than the podcast to offer you. We have a daily newsletter, your go-to source for independent analysis and fresh insights into the Middle East and North Africa. Head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to get our daily newsletter for 2 months for free. Yep, 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. Tony Blair, as the czar of what the document is calling New Gaza, what do you make of that?
Well, on the one hand, he does have 20 years of experience of working with the Middle East Quartet. And I think he himself has said that he wished he had become prime minister later in life because he now has much more experience than he did back in 1997. And that can be leveraged, perhaps. Clearly, he has also high-level relationships with all key players, US and Israel in the Gulf as well, maybe less so with the Palestinians. So, I mean, if somebody can sort of bring things together and give a high-level sort of imprint to the plan, it could be Tony Blair. And I suspect he would be more likely to be involved over the longer term than Donald Trump. So if he is sort of also kind of almost outsource the sort of the supervision of the plan to Tony Blair, then that might actually work. Now, on the other hand, of course, the idea that Tony Blair, with his record in the Middle East, with obviously Iraq is now more than 20 years in the past, but still it's a massive stain on his record. And so I just think he has a lot of history, a lot of baggage. He also may be taking a risk if this plan goes badly wrong. He'll be clearly associated with it.
Yeah. I'm thinking perhaps that Tony Blair will never say that going into Iraq was a mistake. He will never say that. But perhaps this is his way of acknowledging that in terms of his legacy in regards to how the Middle East views him, at least, that this is something that he might be able to manage to pull off. And as you say, he would certainly have more staying power than Donald Trump. You touched on this earlier too, Kristian, the drone strike on Doha, which has caused a unity among the GCC states that I cannot recall ever seeing. So how do you see that unity playing out in the Gaza peace deal?
Well, yes, the strike on Qatar was seen, I think, as a massive escalation, an incredibly aggressive, not just provocative, but an act of international aggression, and clearly an attack on the GCC. An attack on one is an attack on all. And the GCC is much more aligned now than it would have been 10 years ago, for example. So we have seen a process of reconciliation underway for years. And we saw, I mean, just the day after the attack, we saw Mohammed bin Zayed rush from Abu Dhabi to Doha with a very, very senior UAE delegation. We've seen statements in solidarity and support from Qatar. I mean, we've seen the GCC Joint Defense Committee meet to invoke their version of Article 5, which I think is Article 2 in the unified agreement that they have from 2000. So we have seen expressions of solidarity and support. On the other hand, we haven't yet seen concrete measures. We've seen more expressions, but I think certainly in how it plays with Gaza, certainly I think there is a feeling maybe across the Gulf that there is a role for them to play if this plan goes ahead. And if they can be more unified and sort of talking with one voice, then that probably is a good thing. Just obviously, if there is going to be reconstruction of Gaza, there will have to be enormous amounts of resources put into the territory. And clearly, I suspect the Trump plan will be anticipating heavy involvement from the Gulf. Now, this, of course, carries its own risks. There will need to be guarantees that Israel will not simply put up obstacles or potentially just destroy projects like they did with European Union funded projects in Gaza. So clearly there will need to be a lot of safeguards built into that. But if the Gulf can talk with one voice, then that I think just strengthens the potential for something sustainable. Again, a big if.
Yeah, a big if, but it is again perhaps a starting point to achieve some sort of a solution for the Palestinians, at least in Gaza. And we shouldn't forget that, of course, the bombing is continuing, but also the West Bank intrusions and attacks by settlers are continuing, and the increase in the number of settlements that is being pushed forward by Netanyahu. But someone else that I wanted to bring up is the Iranians. They must be watching this deal very closely. Will there be concern in Tehran that Israel will turn its attention once again to strike Iran's nuclear facilities should the Gaza situation quiet down? I mean, is that a front they could move to if this peace deal actually did take hold?
Well, I think there has been concern in Tehran for some time that Israel isn't finished with Iran and that this is a potential. And especially if Gaza quietens down, quote unquote, clearly it will continue to be an issue that needs massive engagement from the international community. But if Israel feels they have a hand freer than they had, then they may strike again. I think people in Tehran are almost expecting that there will be another strike at some point, that the 12-day war in the summer, from an Israeli perspective, was on the one hand very successful in terms of being able to infiltrate to the extent that they did and to identify and take out so many high-value targets. On the other hand, there may be a feeling almost of hubris in Israel and perhaps in the White House as well, or people in DC, that all it takes is one more push, and that we sort of kind of did a big push in June, and one more push and the regime will come tumbling down. I mean, that's a very dangerous assumption to make, but it may be there are people in some capitals who think that that's all it takes. So I certainly think there is a risk of another sort of escalation of that element of the conflict, especially I think if Gaza begins to be less of a central front.
Yeah, but I'm thinking there, of course, of the Gulf states. They must be terrified if that was the outcome, if the Israelis hit Iran hard again, because the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis even are reaching out to Iran.
Yes, they are, and I think there was a feeling in the 12-day war that the worst case scenarios didn't happen. I mean, there were some strikes on energy facilities in the Iranian energy facilities in the South Pars on the coast, but by and large, those were off limits. And Iran also didn't react by threatening, not necessarily to close the Strait of Hormuz, but to harass international shipping in and out. Although, I mean, we did see increases in insurance costs and shipping costs. Premiums went up, and the cost of going in and out of the strait went up. But I think maybe the worst case scenario from a Gulf point of view is that if the regime feels it's about to go down, that they might escalate, and that might include attempts to try and do whatever it takes to stop anything else going in and out of Hormuz, which for Kuwait is completely dependent on oil exports. Qatar with LNG, at least Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia have, to some extent, pipeline alternatives. Oman clearly has a coast on the ocean. So I think were there to be a massive escalation to the point where the Iranian leadership thinks that they're about to go down, they have to do whatever it takes to try and survive. That would be, I think, a worst case scenario that didn't happen over the summer. Probably still unlikely, but still something that would be, I think, being considered as an option, or not option, as a scenario,
Mhm.
in Gulf capitals.
Yeah, and Netanyahu will want to dress up whatever comes out of this Trump deal as a win for him and a win for Israel, but it's hard to see it as that if the deal goes through the way it's structured. Um, but what about Israel's other ambitions? I mean, you've got the extremists in his cabinet pushing hard for greater Israel. You've got the Israeli troops just south of Damascus. You've got this threat of Israel rather hitting the Iranians again. Who's the biggest threat, do you think, right now in the region? Is it Iran or is it Israel?
Well, I think this is one of the most remarkable aspects of the shift in thinking, especially in the Gulf states over the past year, that you see Saudi commentators and officials talking about Israel using language that they would have used about Iran in the past. That Israel is now the threat to stability. And this is even before the attack on Doha, which I think has increased the perception that Israel, the current Israeli leadership at this moment in time, is willing to just completely sort of go beyond whatever red lines had been assumed were there. And in the past, it was Iran that was the sort of the threat. And I think now increasingly Israel is being seen as that. And if you compare and contrast the two attacks on Doha, I mean, Qatar has been attacked this summer first by Iran in June and by Israel in September. It's quite remarkable, really, and almost a testament to the dangers of being the middleman or being the mediator. But the Iranian attack was at least telegraphed in advance, a couple of hours warning given. It was an attack on a US base in the obviously not in a built-up area. Now, debris from the missiles being shot down did fall in built-up areas, but the attack was telegraphed. It was a face-saving almost attempt to try and bring that conflict to an end. It was a signal. Whereas the Israeli attack was it was a missile strike against a building in a busy residential district in the middle of the afternoon rush hour. I mean, you can't imagine a more dangerous, provocative, reckless act. So even the two attacks on Qatar, of course, neither of them are justified, but even the nature of those attacks shows that the risk from Israel, I think, is seen now as very different from the risk from Iran, and something that certainly I think over the last month, since 9th of September, leaders in the Gulf will have been really making that point to the US that if you, Trump, want the trillions of dollars of our investments, we can't live under this shadow. We need guarantees. I mean, the US security guarantee was shown to be, once again after 2019 with the attacks on Saudi oil facilities, questionable. I mean, you have CENTCOM being based, or the forward headquarters being based in Qatar, and the US brought Israel into CENTCOM in 2021, precisely to increase Israel's connectivity with the wider region. And you had this incredible spectacle of one member of CENTCOM launching an airstrike on another within miles of the CENTCOM forward headquarters. And so many questions were certainly being asked about where this leaves the sort of relationship with the US going forward and what kind of guarantees can be put in place to make sure, as the Qatari leadership has expressed time and again, this never happens again.
Mm. Yeah, you're right. The comparison is very interesting between the two attacks, but it also is a measure of perhaps just how far Netanyahu is willing to gamble and how many red lines he's prepared to cross. And you think, well, Israel's sitting there with nuclear weapons. How far are they prepared to go? And this must be weighing on the minds of the GCC states as well. You mentioned the trillions that they have said they want to put into the American economy. Perhaps that too is tilting things away from Netanyahu in Washington.
Yes, I mean, I think it might be. And I think certainly Trump's highly transactional and commercially minded way of policy making is something that Gulf states will be trying to at least leverage. When we saw when Trump went to the Gulf in May, he went to Saudi Arabia, he went to Qatar, he went to Abu Dhabi. He didn't go to Israel. He invited Ahmed al-Shara. He didn't invite the Israeli leadership, even though the Israeli president he took to Twitter to say, I would love to go to Saudi Arabia and shake the hands of Mohammed bin Salman in the presence of Donald Trump. So I think certainly after the May visit, there was a sense of optimism in the Gulf that Trump had seen the possibilities of a secure, stable, prosperous Gulf, the opportunities for him too, obviously. And that was clearly punctured by the 12-day war and, of course, by the Israeli attack on Qatar. And so to what extent can they leverage the promise of those investments to sort of almost get Trump back on track? Because again, the risk is that with Trump, I mean, his attention span could be sort of quite limited, but you think you have him back on track, and then a month down the line, something else happens, and things go south again.
Yeah. Well, finally, Kristian, the Trump deal, as we're talking and recording this podcast, the talks are going on in Cairo, and who knows, perhaps by the time that the Nobel Peace Prize is announced, that there will be some sort of a deal. But even so, you look at the history of the deals that have been made, the way in which those deals have fallen apart, and there are those who say Israel has no intention of honoring these deals. There's no intention. And Netanyahu has been very clear, there will be no Palestinian state. So is this going to prove yet another in that long line of paper promises and broken agreements that deny the Palestinians what they so deserve, particularly looking at the genocide that's going on right now in Gaza?
I think history would certainly suggest that. The record of previous agreements would also suggest that. I think one criticism of past US presidential engagement was often that it was in the final year of a second term. I mean, I'm thinking back to Bill Clinton in 2000, George W. Bush in 2007, when there were almost lame duck presidents, and clearly domestic politics was coming to the fore and a change of administration. At least Trump has another 3+ years in office. But of course, that's mitigated or kind of offset by the fact that we've seen that he doesn't necessarily have staying power, that when things don't work out as he had hoped, then he loses interest. And again, with Russia, Ukraine, that's exactly what happens. And so I think, just past history, the nature of the long record of bad faith negotiations on lack of trust on all sides, and the scale of the destruction of Gaza over the past 2 years, and of course Israel's ongoing trauma from what happened on October the 7th. We mustn't forget that. All sides have, or both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, have now both been through 2 years of extremely traumatic experiences, which I think will reshape how they engage with each other, probably for a generation and more. And so, I mean, that is another issue that we have to factor in, that this is a generational trauma that is going to be very difficult to sort of bring together again.
Yeah, as you say, much suffering on both sides, and so many issues to be resolved in such a complex and difficult situation for the Israelis, for the Palestinians, and of course for all those outside players looking in. It needs good faith bargaining, and I hope that that's what the people of Palestinian, the Palestinian people rather, do get. But in the meantime, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today was Kristian Coates Ulrichsen, a Middle East fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. The Middle East is the single most important story in the world today, and getting a grip on it has never been more important. That's what Arab Digest does with the podcast and our daily newsletter. Here at the Digest, we have a team of analysts, commentators, and writers, contributors like Kristian, providing acute insights and fresh perspectives you will not find anywhere else. And here's something else to think about. As pressure piles on and threatens independent journalism, we are an independent voice, no sponsors and no advertising. Our funding comes only from our subscribers. If you'd like to support that independent voice and plug into everything Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website at arabdigest.org, where we have a free 2-month trial to the newsletter on offer. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. Thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.